On the afternoon of August 24, 1814, James Madison rode out from Washington toward a village called Bladensburg to watch, in person, whether the United States could stop a British army from reaching its own capital. He was the only sitting president in American history who would ever do this, ride toward an active battlefield while holding the office, a decision his own cabinet secretaries reportedly tried and failed to talk him out of that morning. What he watched from that ridge was not a battle so much as a collapse. American militia broke and ran so quickly and so completely that the engagement would be remembered, half-mockingly, as the Bladensburg races. Madison rode back into Washington with just enough time to warn his own government to run. By nightfall, British soldiers were burning the Capitol. By the next morning, they were burning the house he lived in. This is the story of the man who wrote the rules limiting federal power more carefully than almost anyone alive, and then spent a presidency watching those same limits nearly burn his country to the ground. If you've been following this series on the American presidency, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments which chapter you want told next. Keep that fire in mind. It does not end the way you might expect. The day the Capitol burned. The British had landed roughly 4,500 battle-hardened regulars on the Chesapeake shore, fresh from the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, veterans of campaigns against Napoleon's own marshals. They faced an American defense at Bladensburg, built almost entirely from untrained militia, roughly 6,000 men who had never faced disciplined infantry in their lives, and had been assembled with only days of notice. The result was not close. American lines broke within minutes of serious contact, abandoning artillery, muskets, and in some accounts their shoes, in a retreat so fast and so thorough that British officers reportedly struggled to catch up with the men they were chasing. The engagement earned its lasting nickname less as a joke than as a plain description of what actually happened on that field. Madison, who had ridden out that morning with several cabinet members to observe the defense of his own capital, found himself for a brief, chaotic period closer to enemy lines than his own generals had planned for. Close enough that British cavalry were reportedly spotted within a few hundred yards of the presidential party before staff hurried him back toward Washington. He arrived with news that there was, in practical terms, nothing left standing between the British Army and the President's house. Dolly Madison stayed behind at that house for as long as she safely could, refusing to leave until she had secured what she considered irreplaceable. Writing to her sister that same afternoon that she was determined to wait for her husband, even as cannon fire grew audible in the distance. She ordered the large Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington removed from its frame. It was a task her enslaved manservant Paul Jennings and others actually carried out at her direction, breaking the frame's wooden stretcher itself to free the canvas faster when the screws would not come loose in time, before finally fleeing herself just hours ahead of the British advance. The wagon carrying the portrait, state papers, and a set of silver rolled out one road as British advance units approached along another. That evening and into the next day, British troops burned the Capitol, the President's house, the Treasury, and most other public buildings in the city, a deliberate reprisal explicitly ordered in retaliation for an American burning of York, the capital of Upper Canada, the year before. Private homes were largely spared under British officers' direct orders, a restraint meant to distinguish their conduct from what they considered the excesses at York the year before. Government buildings were not. Madison spent that night as a fugitive from his own capital, sleeping in Virginia farmhouses under assumed protection, uncertain for a time even of his own wife's exact location, crossing paths with refugees fleeing the same roads he traveled, ordinary Washington residents carrying what possessions they could on foot. The government of the United States had been reduced, for a few days, to whatever fit in the saddlebags of the men still riding with him. The smallest man in every room. James Madison was born on March 16, 1751, at his grandmother's home in Port Conway, Virginia, the eldest of 10 children born to a prosperous tobacco planter. He was raised at Montpelier his family's plantation in Orange County, an estate his father had built into one of the largest land holdings in the county through generations of careful, if quietly ruthless, expansion. He was, by every surviving account and by later measurement, a genuinely small and physically fragile man, standing perhaps 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing under 100 pounds for most of his adult life, making him almost certainly the smallest and lightest president in American history, by a considerable margin over every man who has held the office since. He suffered throughout his youth from episodes contemporaries described as seizures, likely some form of epilepsy, occasionally accompanied by fainting spells so severe that friends and family reportedly kept a private watch over him during his worst stretches, spells that could leave him incapacitated for hours at a time and unable to speak clearly for a period afterward. It was a condition that left him privately convinced for years that he would not live to see middle age, a fear that shaped a lifelong, almost obsessive attention to his own health, diet, and daily habits, down to a strict personal ritual of warm baths, careful dosing of wine he believed helped manage his condition, and a lifelong avoidance of any activity or excitement his doctors warned might trigger another episode. Rather than attend the College of William and Mary, the conventional choice for a young Virginia gentleman of his standing, and one his own family had likely expected of him given generations of Virginia planters educated there before him, Madison enrolled instead at the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, partly out of concern that Williamsburg's warmer, more disease-prone climate might further damage his fragile constitution. He studied under its formidable president John Witherspoon, a Scottish minister who had brought Enlightenment philosophy and rigorous classical training to the small college. He drove himself through the coursework at a pace that alarmed his own instructors, reportedly compressing what was typically a 4-year course of study into roughly 2 years of near-continuous work, sleeping as little as 4 or 5 hours a night by his own later account, and pushing his already fragile health to a genuine breaking point in the process. The effort broke him entirely. He stayed on at Princeton for an additional year of independent study afterward, too physically depleted to travel the several hundred miles home to Virginia, and returned to Montpelier in 1772, uncertain whether he had the constitution, in either sense of the word, for any sustained public career at all, spending the following several years largely idle, tutoring his younger siblings and reading law without any clear professional direction. Keep that uncertainty in mind. It is about to be tested against men considerably larger and louder than he was. The years of idleness did not last. The gathering crisis with Britain in the mid-1770s drew Madison into local Virginia politics almost by accident, first onto Orange County's Committee of Safety, and then, in 1776, as one of the youngest delegates to Virginia's own convention to draft a state constitution. There, he made his first substantive mark by helping revise George Mason's proposed Declaration of Rights to guarantee religious liberty in stronger, more absolute language than Mason's original draft had allowed, an early sign of the precise, careful legal mind that would later define his entire career. The Silent Architect. By the time the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia in May of 1787, Madison had already done more preparatory work than almost any other delegate in the room. He had spent the preceding months studying the histories of failed confederacies and republics stretching back to ancient Greece and Rome, filling notebooks with comparative analysis of what had caused each one to collapse, a private research project he called his Study of Ancient and Modern Confederacies, undertaken specifically to arrive in Philadelphia with historical evidence for exactly what a new government needed to avoid. He arrived 11 days early, before most other delegates had even left home, with a detailed proposal already drafted and refined through weeks of private correspondence with Washington and other Virginia allies. A plan for an entirely new national government with 3 separate branches and a bicameral legislature apportioned by population. It was presented to the convention by his fellow Virginian Edmund Randolph, but substantially authored by Madison himself in the weeks beforehand. Historians know this document today as the Virginia Plan. and it became the basic working framework the entire convention spent the summer arguing over, amending, and eventually adopting in heavily modified form. So thoroughly reshaped by 4 months of debate among 55 delegates representing wildly different regional interests, that the final Constitution bore only a partial resemblance to Madison's original draft, though its core structural logic, a genuinely national government with direct authority over individual citizens rather than merely the states, survived largely intact against determined opposition from smaller states fearful of losing their equal voice entirely. Madison was, by nearly universal contemporary description, a poor public speaker, soft-voiced and reportedly difficult to hear from more than a few rows back in the sweltering, closed-window convention hall, a physical limitation that meant his influence rarely came from moments of dramatic oratory, the way it did for louder men in the room, men like Gouverneur Morris or the aging, still formidable Benjamin Franklin. What he lacked in delivery, he made up for in preparation, and in a habit that would prove more historically consequential than any single speech he gave that summer. He sat near the front of the room for nearly every session across 4 months of closed-door debate through a brutally hot Philadelphia summer. The windows kept shut against outside eavesdroppers despite the heat, and kept the most complete private record of the debates that exists, filling notebook after notebook with a shorthand transcription of arguments, objections, and compromises that no other delegate bothered to preserve in comparable detail, a task he later admitted had nearly exhausted him as thoroughly as his Princeton coursework once had. He watched and helped negotiate the convention's largest compromises take shape around him over the course of that long summer. There was the Great Compromise, balancing population-based representation in the House against equal state representation in the Senate, a structure Madison himself had originally opposed as a dangerous concession to the smaller states. And there was the deeply troubling 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people toward Southern states' representation, without granting them any of the rights that representation was meant to protect. A provision Madison's own convention notes record him discussing in strikingly clinical, unemotional terms, despite his own lifelong ownership of enslaved people at Montpelier. Those notes, not published until 1840, 4 years after Madison's own death, per his explicit instruction that they wait until every other delegate had also passed away, remain today historians' single most important window into what was actually said inside a convention that otherwise operated under strict and forced secrecy. Madison himself later resisted the title history eventually gave him, insisting in his own words that the Constitution was not the offspring of a single brain, but the work of many heads and many hands. The credit stuck to him anyway, a title he wore with visible discomfort for the remaining decades of his public life. Selling the Constitution. A finished Constitution meant nothing without ratification by at least 9 of the 13 states, and the document faced genuine, well-organized opposition in several of the states that mattered most. Opponents warned openly that the proposed government would eventually swallow the individual states and the liberties of their citizens along with them, and that the entire convention had, in any case, exceeded its original narrow mandate simply to revise the existing Articles of Confederation, rather than replace them outright. A procedural objection Madison and his allies never fully answered, so much as outran with momentum and argument. Working alongside Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, at Hamilton's initial suggestion made almost immediately after the convention adjourned, Madison helped produce a series of 85 essays published in New York newspapers under the shared pseudonym Publius, arguing state by state, clause by clause, for the new government's necessity and safety, often written at extraordinary speed under genuine deadline pressure, sometimes finishing an essay the same day it was due at the printer. The 3 authors reportedly were not always certain themselves which of them had written which unsigned piece by the time the full collection was later compiled into a single published volume. Madison personally wrote roughly 29 of those essays, including Federalist No. 10, an argument about how a large, diverse republic could actually control the dangers of political faction better than a small one could. directly inverting the conventional wisdom of the era that only small, homogeneous republics could survive. He also wrote Federalist Number 51, laying out the logic of checks and balances between branches of government in language, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition," still quoted in law schools more than 2 centuries later. Both essays are still assigned in university political theory courses today, among the most influential works of American political thought ever produced under deadline pressure for a newspaper. The essays helped shape opinion in New York and beyond, but the hardest fight was closer to home. At Virginia's own ratifying convention in June of 1788, Madison faced open, forceful opposition from Patrick Henry, whose oratory dwarfed his own by any measure, and who spoke for hours at a stretch, warning of federal tyranny, and George Mason, both insisting the proposed Constitution concentrated dangerous, unchecked power in a distant federal government, far removed from the people it governed. Madison, working the debate through careful, methodical argument rather than rhetorical fire, appearing frail and unwell for much of the convention's duration, helped secure Virginia's ratification by a narrow margin of 89 votes to 79, a vote that, alongside New York's equally close ratification the following month, effectively decided whether the new government would actually function or collapse before it began. The bill he didn't want to write. During the ratification fight itself, Madison had argued, genuinely and at some length, against the necessity of adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, a position he shared at the time with Hamilton and most other prominent Federalists, reasoning that a government of specifically enumerated powers already implicitly protected everything it was not given authority to touch, and worrying, in his own private correspondence, that listing certain rights by name might dangerously imply that any right left unlisted enjoyed no protection at all, a concern later partially addressed by the Ninth Amendment's language reserving unenumerated rights to the people. Thomas Jefferson, watching from his diplomatic post in Paris, disagreed sharply and said so in letter after letter across nearly 2 years of correspondence, arguing plainly that a Bill of Rights was what the people were entitled to against any government. Enough anti-Federalist delegates across several state conventions had conditioned their support for ratification on a firm promise that amendments would follow immediately, that Madison found his own theoretical objection increasingly untenable as a matter of practical politics, whatever its intellectual merits. He changed his position, and having changed it, did so completely and without visible reluctance. Elected to the new House of Representatives in the first Congress, narrowly defeating fellow future President James Monroe in a hard-fought Virginia district race that Madison himself later credited to a promise he made voters to pursue exactly these amendments. Madison personally drafted and shepherded through Congress the package of amendments that became the Bill of Rights, sorting through more than 200 proposals submitted by the various state ratifying conventions, many overlapping and some directly contradictory, to distill them into the 12 amendments Congress ultimately approved and sent to the states, 10 of which were ratified in 1791. The same man who had once argued the exercise was unnecessary now served as its principal author and most persistent advocate on the House floor, pushing the amendments through a Congress that, by that point, had largely lost interest in the project once ratification itself was secured. Few reversals in American political history have proven quite so consequential or quite so quietly admitted. Madison's own turn as a strict constructionist arguing against expansive federal power came just 2 years later in 1791, when Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton proposed chartering a national bank to stabilize the young country's finances. Madison, still serving in the House, rose to argue forcefully that nothing in the Constitution's specific list of enumerated powers authorized Congress to create a bank at all, that the document's necessary and proper clause could not be stretched to cover something so far beyond what its framers, himself very much included, had actually intended to permit. Hamilton won that argument in Congress and with Washington, who signed the bank's charter into law over Madison's strict constructionist objections. a defeat that pushed Madison and Jefferson closer together politically and helped harden the divide that would soon become the country's first organized party system. It was during these same years in Philadelphia, then serving as the national capital, that Madison, a bachelor well into his 40s and widely assumed by friends to be permanently uninterested in marriage, was introduced by a mutual friend, the senator and future vice president Aaron Burr, to a lively young widow named Dolly Payne Todd. The two married in September of 1794, Madison 17 years her senior, and by every surviving account, the marriage transformed Madison's public presentation almost overnight. Dolly's natural warmth and social ease compensating for exactly the qualities, small stature, quiet voice, awkward formality and company, that had limited Madison's effectiveness as a political operator for his entire career up to that point. She would go on to become, by most historians' accounts, the most consequential presidential spouse of the era, and the same instinct for calm, decisive action under pressure that would later save Washington's portrait from the flames was already, by 1794, a defining feature of her character. Jefferson's right hand. When Jefferson became president in 1801, he appointed Madison Secretary of State, formalizing a political partnership that had already run for nearly 2 decades and would continue for decades more. The two Virginians, so closely aligned in political philosophy and personal friendship that contemporaries frequently discussed them as a single, continuous political project, rather than 2 separate careers, their Montpelier and Monticello estates only about 30 miles apart, and their correspondence running to thousands of letters across their lifetimes. Madison oversaw much of the diplomatic and administrative machinery behind the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the same territorial expansion whose constitutional legitimacy Jefferson himself had privately doubted enough to draft an amendment over, a doubt Madison had personally helped talk him out of pursuing, arguing then, as he would argue again more forcefully after the War of 1812, that the treaty power already granted the president sufficient authority to act without further amendment, a position notably more flexible than the one he had taken on the bank a decade earlier. That same year, Madison found himself the named defendant in Marbury versus Madison, sued by William Marbury, a Federalist Justice of the Peace appointee whose commission Madison, acting on Jefferson's direct instruction, had refused to deliver after the change in administration. Part of a broader effort by the incoming Jefferson team to block a wave of last-minute judicial appointments the outgoing Adams administration had rushed through in its final days. Appointments critics on Jefferson's side derisively labeled the Midnight Judges. Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling in that case, while denying Marbury the specific remedy he sought, established the far larger and more lasting principle of judicial review, the Supreme Court's authority to strike down laws it judged unconstitutional, a foundational pillar of American constitutional law, decided in a case where Madison himself was, procedurally speaking, on the losing and technically law-breaking side. Madison was also deeply involved in crafting the Embargo Act of 1807, an attempt to pressure both Britain and France into respecting American neutral shipping rights by cutting off American trade with both nations entirely, rather than risk war with either. The embargo devastated American port economies, particularly in New England, far more severely than it damaged either European power, provoked widespread smuggling and open political defiance across the northern states, and was repealed in the final days of Jefferson's presidency after roughly 15 months of mounting economic pain. A policy failure Madison would inherit the political consequences of the moment he took office himself, just weeks later. His own administration's early attempts to replace the embargo with softer measures, the Non-Intercourse Act and later Macon's Bill No. 2, which reopened trade with both European powers on the condition that either one formally recognize American neutral rights, fared little better, manipulated by a resurgent Napoleon into a diplomatic trap that left Madison further committed to confrontation with Britain than genuine strategy alone might have dictated. The war nobody was ready for. Madison became president in 1809, inheriting an unresolved conflict with Britain that had only worsened across the preceding years. British warships continued impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy by force, seizing thousands of men off American merchant vessels on the claim that they were British subjects, regardless of the papers they carried. British agents were widely believed to be arming and encouraging Native American resistance under the Shawnee leader Tecumseh along the northwestern frontier, and ongoing trade restrictions tied to the Napoleonic Wars kept strangling American commerce from both the British and French directions at once. A newer, more aggressive faction in Congress, the War Hawks, led by the young Kentucky Speaker Henry Clay and South Carolina's John C. Calhoun, both elected to Congress only in 1810 and quickly dominating its agenda despite their inexperience, pushed hard for a formal declaration of war, motivated by genuine grievance over impressment and frontier violence, and for some among them, by open ambition toward British Canada as well, a territorial prize Clay himself predicted could be conquered by American militia alone within weeks. In June of 1812, Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war against Great Britain, and Congress granted it by the closest and most geographically divided vote for war in the nation's history to that point, 79 to 49 in the House and a bare 19 to 13 in the Senate, with New England's Federalist-leaning representatives almost uniformly opposed, and some New England states refusing for much of the war to place their own militias under federal command at all. The country Madison had just committed to war was almost comically unprepared to fight one, a gap between ambition and actual capacity that his own most careful theoretical writing had never quite anticipated needing to solve in practice. The regular army numbered only a few thousand men scattered across a vast frontier. State militias were unreliable, poorly trained, and constitutionally difficult for a president to command outside their own state borders without a governor's cooperation. The Navy, that had once impressed the world during the Revolution, had shrunk to a handful of frigates against Britain's global fleet of hundreds of warships. Early American attempts to invade Canada in the war's opening months collapsed almost immediately in a series of embarrassing failures, including the surrender of an entire American army at Detroit without a shot fired in its final defense, making painfully clear just how large the gap was between the war Congress had voted for and the army Madison actually had available to fight it with. The irony was not lost on Madison's own political opponents, who delighted in pointing out that the same man who had spent the 1780s and 1790s warning against the dangers of a powerful, well-funded standing military, had now committed the country to precisely the kind of prolonged conflict such an institution existed to fight, without ever having built one. Federalist newspapers in New England, already hostile to the war, took to calling it Mr. Madison's War, a label meant as an insult that stuck to the conflict in popular memory for generations afterward. The fire. By the summer of 1814, Napoleon's abdication in Europe had freed thousands of hardened British veterans for deployment to America, and a British force under Major General Robert Ross sailed into the Chesapeake Bay with Washington itself as an explicit, deliberately symbolic target. A strike meant to humiliate the young republic and demoralize its government rather than to hold American territory permanently. A punitive raid rather than a genuine invasion. The rest of this story, the collapse at Bladensburg, Madison's own presence near the fighting, Dolly Madison's last-minute rescue of Washington's portrait, the burning of the Capitol and the president's house that followed, is the moment this video opened with, and it deserves to be understood now not as an isolated humiliation, but as the direct, undeniable proof of every structural weakness Madison's own government had carried into the war. Madison himself, according to several accounts from officers present that day, had ridden out not merely to observe, but with some private hope of steadying the militia's resolve simply through the visible presence of the presidency itself. A hope the actual collapse of American lines within the war's first hour made painfully naive in retrospect. No standing army worth the name, no reliable way to compel militia service beyond a state's own borders, no navy capable of contesting British control of the Chesapeake for even a single afternoon. A sudden storm, possibly a hurricane remnant moving up the coast, swept through Washington the following day, helping extinguish the remaining fires and disrupting British operations badly enough, by several contemporary accounts, that the occupying force withdrew after roughly 26 hours in the city, rather than press its advantage further. Madison returned to a capital with its two most important buildings gutted to their stone walls. The government temporarily relocated to a nearby building normally used to house the patent office, one of the only public structures the British had deliberately spared. And yet, in one of the stranger reversals in American political memory, the war's final months rehabilitated Madison's presidency almost entirely. Fort McHenry held against a sustained British naval bombardment of Baltimore that same September, an all-night barrage witnessed from a nearby ship where he had been detained under a flag of truce by the American lawyer Francis Scott Key, who watched the fort's flag still flying by the light of the rockets and inspired the poem that would eventually become the national anthem. Andrew Jackson's decisive, lopsided victory at New Orleans in January of 1815, fought after a peace treaty had already been signed in Europe, but before word of it could cross the Atlantic on the slow ships of the era, gave the war a triumphant final image, regardless of the treaty's actual modest terms. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December of 1814 and ratified by the Senate in February of 1815, restored essentially the exact borders and pre-war conditions that existed before the fighting began, resolving none of the specific grievances, impressment chief among them, that had supposedly justified the war in the first place, a fact contemporary critics were quick to point out even as the celebrations continued. Domestically, thanks largely to Baltimore and New Orleans arriving in the news almost simultaneously with the peace itself, the war was received as a vindication anyway. By 1815, the Federalist Party, whose New England delegates had gathered that same winter at the Hartford Convention to discuss grievances against the war effort, and, in some quarters, even the possibility of secession, found itself so thoroughly discredited by the war's apparently triumphant ending that the party would not field a competitive presidential candidate again within a decade. The bank he once called illegal. The war's near-catastrophic financial and logistical strain left Madison, by his own private account, genuinely chastened about the practical costs of the limited federal government he had spent his career defending in theory. The first bank of the United States, chartered under Hamilton's original plan and an institution Madison had voted against and argued was unconstitutional back in the 1790s, had been allowed to lapse in 1811, when Congress narrowly declined to renew its charter, and its absence during the war that followed had made financing the conflict considerably harder than it needed to be, forcing the government to borrow at punishing rates from a fractured, uncoordinated banking system that nearly collapsed under the strain by the war's final year. In 1816, the same James Madison signed into law a charter for the Second Bank of the United States, the exact category of institution he had once insisted the Constitution did not permit Congress to create, reasoning now, in language that echoed almost precisely the arguments Hamilton had made against him decades earlier, that necessity, established precedent, and the express acquiescence of the American people across more than 20 years had together settled a constitutional question his younger self had considered closed in the opposite direction. He also signed the Tariff of 1816, the first tariff in American history explicitly designed to protect young domestic manufacturers rather than simply raise government revenue, and supported maintaining a peacetime standing army and navy at a scale his younger self would have found difficult to justify on paper. The strict constructionist who had once measured every proposed federal action against the narrowest possible reading of enumerated powers, spent his final years in office building, piece by piece, the stronger federal apparatus that same narrow reading had always been designed to prevent. He retired to Montpelier in 1817 and lived there for nearly 2 decades, remaining active in public life as an elder statesman consulted by successive presidents, spending much of his final years defending his own decades-old handiwork against a new generation of states' rights arguments he found genuinely alarming. Writing extensively against South Carolina's nullification doctrine in the early 1830s, the claim, advanced most forcefully by his fellow founding-era war hawk John C. Calhoun, that individual states retained the right to declare federal laws void within their own borders. Madison, the same man who had once distrusted an overreaching federal government more than almost anyone in Philadelphia, spent his final public writings insisting that no such right had ever been intended by the document he had helped draft. A last quiet irony in a life already full of them. He continued throughout these same years to enslave more than 100 people across his estate, and unlike George Washington, whose will freed the people he personally enslaved, Madison's own will did not, leaving his estate to sell most of them after his death to satisfy considerable debts accumulated over decades of declining tobacco profits, poor harvests, and his stepson John Payne Todd's chronic gambling debts and financial mismanagement of the plantation's affairs during Madison's own final years. A private humiliation Madison largely bore in silence. Late in life, he served as president of the American Colonization Society, an organization promoting the resettlement of free Black Americans in West Africa, a cause many contemporaries considered a genuinely progressive compromise at the time, and that most historians since have judged, at best, as a way of avoiding the harder and more direct question of emancipation and citizenship at home. James Madison died at Montpelier on June 28, 1836, the last surviving delegate of the Constitutional Convention, the final living signature on a document he had spent a lifetime interpreting narrowly, and, when the fire finally came for his own capital, watched himself help build wider than he had ever originally intended. Go back, one final time, to the ridge above Bladensburg. To a small, frail man, watching an army built on his own government's structural weaknesses collapse in front of him, within minutes. He had spent his entire adult life arguing that federal power, left unchecked, was the greater danger to liberty, filling notebooks with the historical evidence, writing the essays, drafting the amendments, always working from the same underlying conviction that a government given too much room to act would eventually find a reason to abuse it. He spent his presidency learning, in the most humiliating way available to any head of state, that federal weakness could burn a capital just as completely as federal overreach could ever threaten to. The Constitution he is remembered for writing survived that fire largely intact, rebuilt within the same walls, still operating today under most of the same structural logic he had argued into existence in a sweltering Philadelphia room nearly 3 decades earlier. The theory behind it did not survive quite so cleanly. Madison rebuilt both the city and, more quietly, his own convictions, and by the time he finally left office in 1817, the government he had signed into stronger, wealthier, more centralized existence looked considerably less like the one he had once sworn, on paper and in 85 newspaper essays, he would never allow to exist. Historians still debate whether that reversal makes him a hypocrite or simply an honest witness to his own theory's limits, a man willing to let real experience overrule an argument he had once found completely persuasive on paper. Perhaps the fairest reading is the one Madison himself seems to settle into by the end, that the Constitution he helped write was never meant to be a fixed, final answer, but a framework built specifically to be argued over, tested, and occasionally bent by the very people sworn to defend it, himself included, when the country's survival genuinely required it.